Good morning from Australia's national capital. We're broadcasting today from Parliament House in Canberra to discuss the state of politics and how we report it. With me to discuss the various issues are Shalala Medora, a political reporter for the public broadcasters Triple J Hack, Mark Riley, who's political editor for broadcaster 7 News,
Morning.
and Catherine Murphy, political editor with The Guardian Australia. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Let's start with the observations of a veteran political player who was both a reporter and a press secretary to a former Prime Minister, who now believes the culture of politics in Australia is the worst he has seen in 50 years. Catherine, you recently described Australian politics as caterwauling hell we can't seem to escape. What do you put that down to?
That must have been a good day.
It was a very good day.
I was obviously in a great mood that day. Look, over the last 10 years, we have seen an escalation in polarisation, hyperpartisanship and conflict as its own currency. And that has filtered back through the political system. Politics fundamentally is about conflict. I don't think we should be shy about that or concerned about that or worried about that. In fact, politics is built around conflict. Deliberation requires competing views to be synthesised. So I'm not raising conflict as a problem per se, but what has happened for a bunch of reasons that I'm sure we're going to get into in this conversation, we have seen this escalation of conflict for its own sake, rather than conflict as a means to solving problems. And I think that's kind of at the root of some of the cultural problems we've seen in our politics and in democracies around the world, frankly. I think we should say, though, before we get too much further, that 2020 has been an amazing year. We've had a coronavirus pandemic. We've had a global and a local recession, first recession in Australia for 30 years. COVID has been a circuit breaker for some of the worst of politics that we've seen over the last decade. We've seen a very constructive period in Australian politics, certainly in the first 6 months of this year. We've run wildly off the rails in the second. Short-lived, but we did see a ceasefire. And I think the public understood that, related to that, and dare I say, crept slowly back towards their politics again. A poll that we do at Guardian Australia, the Essential poll, has tracked a really fascinating renaissance in public trust in institutions and in politics, and even briefly in the media.
Wow.
As a consequence of events this year. So rather than exactly. So we're going to get into a bit of self-flagellation, I imagine, in this conversation. But I want to just say up front, we have seen a break in the weather this year, and it's been significant and interesting.
Okay. Mark, I'm old enough to vividly recall the political turmoil of the 70s. No doubt you were in primary school at that stage. And that was much to the amazement of Shalala a few months ago when we were discussing the dismissal, and I personally experienced it, but not as a reporter. But we saw a democratically elected government was dismissed by the Australian representative of an unelected British monarch. Are concerns about the modern day culture of politics justified?
They are. Are they any different to political periods of the past? So 75 was obviously a time of great turmoil. The interesting thing there, I think, that's opposite to what we're going through now is that in 75 you had people massing on the steps of Parliament demanding that the Governor-General throw out the government that he just installed and reimplant the government that had been thrown out and what have you. A lot of noise and a lot of protest, and then it was put to the people in an election, and all that noise was completely overwhelmed by the numbers, and the government was roundly thrown out. So, the noise isn't always reflective of public sentiment, it's just loud, and it's obvious, and it's reported because it's there. And at that time, because the media is quite different, it's quite diverse. What Catherine says is quite right. We're magnifying things now. The ripple effect of what happens here in a political culture that is based on conflict. Let's just say what we reflect here is what happens in our parliament, what happens in our political debate. It's an adversarial system. It's a system of discussion that becomes mostly a system of argument. and where people make points as they would in a court of law, and are then they're congratulated and rewarded for doing that, for embarrassing an opponent, for exposing an opponent, for humiliating an opponent to get a point through, to get a point made. So, you know, we're reflective of that system. Are we a symptom, or, you know, are we a cause? Is it chicken or is it egg?
Yes.
Are we all responsible? Yes, I think so. But going back to your core question, in 75, a time of constitutional turmoil, was it worse or better than it is now? I think the political culture at that time, that was a peak of interest in the political culture and what was seen as an abrogation of sovereign rights of the Australian people to decide who their government was, and, you know, for the monarchy to keep its nose out of it. I think the worst period, frankly, isn't now. I think the worst period of our modern politics, at least, was 2010 to 2012, where here, outside the Parliament, for the first time, and you know, I know I'm baby-faced, but I've been in journalism for 41 years since I was a kid. The first time in 41 years of journalism, I was spat on by people because I was a journalist, reporting on people who were complaining about a carbon tax that didn't exist. But I didn't say anything. I was actually down watching a cavalcade of people who came to massed on the streets, as they did on the steps of Parliament, just like they did in 75. But they turned not just on the politicians, but on the media as well, and anybody had an alternate view. So that was particularly ugly period, and I think things are better now than they were then.
I actually started in, as a political reporter around that 2010-2011 period, so that's all I've known. And it's really fascinating for me to read historical, and speaking to Richard about historical events, and, you know, looking back at how politics used to be, and talking to some of the older members of the press gallery, and just seeing how different it really was back in the old days, I suppose. And the thing that strikes me from a politician's point of view is that there seems to be, yes, conflict, but ultimately compromise out of that conflict. And I don't see that anymore as a political reporter, as a young political reporter. I don't see politicians butting heads over things, but ultimately finding a compromise that they can both work on. And I don't know if that's a relatively new phenomenon. Maybe it was just looking at history through sort of rose-tinted glasses. But that's the thing to me that I kind of notice when I look at how, say, Hawke or Keating or, you know, some of the older prime ministers operated, is they were ruthless, but then they ultimately found something that everyone in Parliament could work on.
Consensus.
Yeah. And I feel like that's something that I haven't noticed.
That's good. You are sort of broadcasting to a more young or youthful audience than the rest of us. What's your audience and contemporaries of your generation, what are they telling you about the state of politics and how it's reported?
I think, and I don't think it's just young people, I think it's very much across the board. The number of people who are interested in politics as politics is diminishing. That's not to say that people aren't interested in topics and policies. They are deeply, deeply invested in policies, but they don't feel like politicians are necessarily the way forward in achieving outcomes. So I'll give you the example of climate change. So young people very, very deeply care about climate change, and this is on both sides of the spectrum. There are a lot of young people who identify as conservative, who want action on climate change. The only thing is, climate change isn't an ideological position for young people. It's not a I believe in it or I don't. It's we believe in it and we just want action. That way we want action is different. But they don't look to politicians as necessarily being the people who solve this. They look at personal action very deeply. So they're often people who will protest. They're people who will go on recycling drives. They're people who clean up their natural environment. They look at personal responsibility very, very deeply. And I think that's in part because they have been overlooked by politicians, so they don't necessarily feel like politicians are talking to them. But also I feel it's just a deep sense of responsibility that younger generations have going forward to fix things that have been overlooked in the past. So political culture-wise, I think there's a deep mistrust of politicians. Again, I don't think that's just young people, but I think that they look to solutions in their own backyards a little bit more than maybe older generations do.
Mark, you touched on about our responsibility or our influence on the political culture. I mean, how much responsibility do we have to take for the change in the culture?
I think we take a significant part of it. I mean, we reflect what's happening. We hold a mirror up to what we're seeing before us, but we also need to moderate what's said by whom and provide context. I think that's the element that's often missing in modern reporting, and I'm not so sure that that's a larger issue than it was in 75 or another in previous periods. However, it is a problem that context is essential, and when voices are elevated beyond their real natural station and given prominence when they shouldn't be, or perhaps they're given prominence without question or without rebuttal, then that's a real issue, and I see more of that occurring. So I think objectivity, context, and allowing people to know, not just to present a voice, but to say, where is this voice from? What's its vested interest? What's its dog in this fight? To provide that. If you do that, that's good journalism.
Catherine, you've done touching on a little self-reflection in a couple of columns recently about your own role and the way you've covered certain political events. How do you feel about media taking some responsibility for what's happened?
Well, we do have to take responsibility for what's happened, but I think something that's missed among consumers of media, because we don't talk about it much, is that partly we are enabling this phenomenon because we too have been profoundly disrupted. Our business has been profoundly disrupted. And we don't, because we're not a particularly self-reflective bunch, like as a sort of sociological phenomenon, we're not particularly self-reflective, and also we believe, I think, very passionately, all of us, that we've got a big job to do, and we just want to get on with doing that. We don't convey to the public exactly what has happened to our business since the internet, and how profound that change has been. So I'm not saying, I am a self-hating journalist, that's true, thank you for noticing.
It's self-reflection.
No, but I still, I believe very passionately in this. I consider journalism a vocation, not a job. Yeah. But anyway, all I'm saying is that very complex things have happened and very quickly over the last sort of decade to 15 years. Our business models, all of our business models, obviously ABC has had funding cuts, but if you work in the commercial media, you have literally been upended in a very short space of time. Right. That has created different signals, incentives, ways of operating, ways of organising, ways of reporting that have basically, I pick up on Mark's objectivity point, right? That's what's been smashed. The internet has basically removed that what we used to call voice of God, narration, objectivity in journalism, because what the internet has done has forced mainstream media companies to chase paying audiences and subscribers and revenue models. What technology has done has herded the world into tribes, because the algorithms of social media give you things you agree with. That's what's happened.
The echo chamber.
So technology has created an echo chamber. The mainstream media sits astride the echo chamber now, trying to find viable business models for itself. That sort of shared reality, fact-based, voice of God, objective narration of facts has been a casualty of that. And we have seen that, we've seen the implications of that for society. So I'm not saying, woe is us, we are victims, please feel sorry for us. I think everyone sitting at this table and everybody in the corridor that we work in is plying an honest trade and trying to find a way through these very complicated phenomena. But we need to talk about that more so our audiences understand that. And also, as part of educating our audiences and keeping them self-aware, every time I speak in public, I say to people, keep reading things you don't agree with.
Yeah.
Seek them out, because they're
challenge your orthodoxies.
Challenge your orthodoxies. Keep that muscle memory.
We do it every day.
Well, exactly, but that's what's happening in our society, and that is being reflected in how media companies are attempting to find business models and operate.
Can I pick up a couple of points? I mean, terrific points made by Catherine. One thing in our world is commercial television. it's very expensive to prosecute good journalism.
Yes.
The technicalities of setting up a studio, the one person you see in front of the camera reflects 10, 12 people behind the camera on a daily basis, and we have a team of 15, and one story normally at 6 o'clock in a network news bulletin, but stories through the day. And now, where it was only one story a day, we're now reporting from 5 a.m, 5:30, 6, and on top and bottom of the hour all day, and then to major news programs through the day, and then on other platforms. I had a group of school kids here the other day and they said, how has the business changed in your experience, which is a large question. So I had to provide a small answer they could connect with. I said, well, put it this way. I come to work each day. Consider me, I make something. I make widgets. I'm a watchmaker. I come in each day and I make a watch. At 6 o'clock, there it is. At 6:05, someone steals that watch every single day and flogs it on the internet to many more people who could buy it from me. And nothing in the legal structures of our country can prevent them from doing it. That is destroying our commercial model as a business. As a watchmaker, every single day someone steals what I do and then goes and markets it for themselves and their eyes open up. That's what happens with my journalism each day.
And just picking up on something Catherine said about, being able to track what people read and how they engage. I mean, I think that's a double-edged sword, and I think audiences also need to reflect on that. Like, we can produce, and we have, and we do produce stories that have incredible significance, are incredibly important, might be a bit dense and dry, but are really, really important to the functioning of democracy or the reflections on society. And sometimes those get a fraction of the clicks that a story about a celebrity falling over, for example, would get. And you think, I put a day's work into this story. I put 10 minutes of work into reporting on like a video of someone tripping over, and this is where people are looking. And sometimes it's not even what we produce. Sometimes it's just that those things aren't getting the traction they need. And I think audiences also need to reflect on what they consume. And it's often the part of the puzzle that people don't want to hear. They don't want to hear that there are things being produced that they say could change things, and they're just not looking at them. But I think it's really significant and important that audiences also reflect on how they consume media and what they consume, and the fact that things, really important pieces of journalism, are expensive and they take a lot of time. And if you're not reading them, then it just means that our bosses will say next time round, well, maybe that is an important thing for you to look at. But if no one's reading it or no one's consuming it, what's the point?
I agree with that. And though, I think the responsibility partially is on us to tell the story in a way that connects.
Yes.
And there's no better way to tell a story than through a narrative, through a person.
Exactly.
So someone that they can see a reflection of their own existence in a narrative story in someone's experiences and reflect upon their own, then you've grabbed the audience.
I just want to go back to the culture of politics. So recently, opposition Labor MP Claire O'Neill, it's almost like a one-woman band at the moment. She believes part of the problem with the political culture is that we're addicted to conflict, both politicians and the media. And I'll just read out what she says here, that we should strive to have a kind of politics where people looking on could only conclude politicians are working in their best interests, that the fight is for them, not with each other. So let's go back to the glimpse of the early months of the pandemic, Catherine, and what we saw as, I think you called it a circuit breaker, and it worked quite well. And I think everyone was impressed. The opinion polls showed that people liked the National Cabinet, liked what our leaders were doing, and then it frayed at the edges. Is what Claire O'Neill is suggesting achievable?
Look, to a degree, yes, and you would hope that those conditions could operate outside a crisis. You would hope that we haven't lost that capacity to just operate that way in normal conditions. Shalila picked up on the main point of that, though, which is the lost art of compromise. It's sort of within. I was talking about tribalisation a minute ago, this sort of phenomenon of technology kind of splitting the world into enclaves, right? That also has impacted politics and the way politics is practiced. Now, political movements feel like they have to signal to their base. They have to signal to a small number of people who are paid up members of their own political organisation. And so that requires a lot of performance art in politics to tell the base that you are, you're virtuously pursuing the sort of the shibboleths of that political movement,
clutching
right?
this piece of coal.
Exactly, exactly.
That's right.
There's all this kabuki, there's all this performance art, right? And for most people watching on to politics, because they're not members of political movements, they would look at that and think, what on earth is that, right?
Are they trying to find their tribe? Are they saying, well, that's me. I'm that person in the Japanese get-up? Or
No, no. Well, quite. But the point of that is that the system actually doesn't create a lot of incentives for compromise, is the point, because everyone's sort of signalling to their own rusted-ons, and then for a brief period during election cycles, everyone sprints to the middle and fights vigorously over the middle for about 6 weeks, right, before then breaking back into their kabuki. There's not much incentive in the system now to compromise. It's sort of hard to think about, well, not impossible, but it's kind of hard to think about a big compromise where the major parties could come together, reach an agreement. Climate change is a good one to run through your mind. Just think about that in the real world and how difficult that would be, not because it's the wrong thing to do, but because there's no incentives to do it.
Look, we earlier heard from Ralph Ashton from the Australian Futures Project. He's sort of putting a lot of emphasis on the media's role and says that we need to enhance social cohesion and optimism rather than inflaming polarisation and cynicism. And he argues the conflict culture is creating an us and them mentality rather than a give and take approach. That could apply to politicians as much as the media. I mean, who does take the first step on more give and take approach, politicians or the media?
I think it has to be a collective effort, doesn't it? But it also, I mean, I go back to the fundamental structure of our political system. There's one mob on one side of the house yelling at the other mob on the other side of the house. How do we present that as some sort of Disney fantasy where it's all people in harmony holding hands and singing Kumbaya? Yes. It would be an incorrect reflection of reality. So we're limited in that way. It's what Catherine's talking about, that the need for consensus is true, and people actually respond quite well to it. But political parties have taken and seen how effective taking the absolute opposite approach is. If you think about Tony Abbott in 2010 saying no to everything the government put up, putting the opposition back in oppositions, and the Republican Senate under Barack Obama, the sort of Republican Senate we're going to see under Joe Biden, which is prepared to lock down the entire economy to embarrass the bloke who inhabits the big White House. I mean, this is the political system being used by parties to, in a zero-sum game to achieve their ends. So how do we change that? Well, I think it actually has to come from the people as much as anything else. Yes. The people have to say, we've had a gutful of this. We don't want you people yelling at each other. Can't you agree? However,
how will that be expressed, though?
Well, I think it's probably, I mean, you can...
In America, it was just expressed at the ballot box.
At the ballot box,
yeah.
Well, that's the ultimate expression, of course, is the ballot box. But it's also holding politicians to their promises. So Biden has for that example, has promised a more amenable, a more open-minded polity. Well, let's hold him to it. Let's see if he can do it. However, there are things that are beyond his control, like a Republican-dominated Senate. They won't allow him to do that. So everyone has to be invested in it. Everyone has to buy into the process.
And I'm not sure about this idea of, people being sick to the back teeth of conflict, because, and social media isn't a reflection of society at all. I totally accept that. But what I hear more and more of is that people are frustrated that we, as the media, have failed to hold politicians to account. I'm hearing that more and more and more from everyone. Like, we're letting press conferences run in which lies are just spewed forth without any kind of challenge. So I don't know that people are sick of conflict. Maybe they're sick of the way that accountability is represented. Maybe they don't like the butting heads kind of approach. But I do think there is a real appetite out there for us as the front line of democracy in a lot of ways when it comes to, say, President Trump as an example, of holding people like that to account and saying, this is a lie, this is a lie, this is a lie, and actually just calling it a lie.
Becoming more active in the conflict,
Well,
creating more conflict.
Can I just pick up that point of Shalaya's, because I think that's really important, because the comments that preceded this bit of our discussion were about journalism being part of a consensus, right, or part of a cohesion exercise. Look, that's actually not our role in a democracy. Now, it might be an end point, and I would hope that it could be an end point, but it is not actually our role. Our role, and I think some of the problems in journalism come from not understanding what the role is. The role is to hold power to account. That is our role as political journalists. We have to speak truth to power. That's the job. That creates friction, because it's not a consensus business. That's a challenge business, and that is what we need to do. Now, the problem is, I think, and it sort of gets to the nub of the difficulties we face, is that once upon a time, pre-internet, our challenging role in a democracy was part of creating shared facts, shared realities. That's what the mass media did in society. It created a set of facts around which we could all broadly agree. Now, that has broken down. So now what we see is challenge and friction in our system without the synthesis, which is the shared reality. So I think that's what people are seeing. But then I would not myself advocate becoming a consensus builder as a journalist. It's not the job.
And I just have to pick up on that too.
Yes.
Like in the past, a lot of the shared consensus was very monolithic and didn't allow for any diversity. And
That is also true.
So maybe it's not such a bad thing that that's not there anymore. I feel like now we are having more and more voices in the media, which is so important. And perhaps the breakdown of that consensus is really actually important to reflect what Australia looks like
Let's
now.
just take up that point about more voices. So I want to just take up what Ashton said about vested interests. Now, those of us who have worked here a long time have seen the enormous growth in stakeholder and advocacy groups. I just wonder whether you think that they helped governments to make better policy or actually hinder them, and whether sometimes we aid the hindering by focusing on people who actually lose out rather than a wider community benefit. Want to go for that one?
Oh, it's a difficult one. I think it depends on who the lobbyists are, like who the voices are. I mean, I think about a program in Australia. Our international audience might not be familiar with it, but it's called Robo-Debt. So it was basically the automated debt recovery system that the government imposed maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And this is it was very much a grassroots movement to oppose this particular policy. And if it hadn't have been for those voices of people who came from disadvantaged backgrounds, who would never otherwise get a voice in public debate, we wouldn't be at the point where that policy has been reversed. So I think it depends, really, really does depend on who those voices are.
I think that's a really good example of an advocacy group that works positively. What about those who have really vested interests, like financial or vested interests as far as policy is concerned?
Yeah,
I mean,
well, the smart ones, if is smart the right term? The effective ones are able to leverage the capitalist and democratic systems for their own means. So money, they use money. If you think about a government trying to reform the taxation system, maybe it's a super profits tax in the mining sector, maybe it's a sovereign wealth fund in other countries, but some sort of change to the taxation system, fundamental structural change to the taxation system that's for the greater good, but a vested interest finds that is that's going to have a negative effect on their balance sheet, and then spends a lot of money on effective, loud campaign, and reminds politicians that they fund their political party and their pre-selections, and can help them in their electorates. That can affect policy. So, and that's a real world experience. We've had that in Australia. I'm not saying that the legislation I'm talking about was was perfectly elegant and would have worked 100%, very, very, very rarely does. However, I think for the greater good was probably a good piece of legislation that was howled out of the Parliament, and in the end led to the downfall of a government in some ways. So I think there's a very, very large question about the effect of disproportionate effect of moneyed interest groups on a process to skew it to their commercial benefit, to skew the democratic system for their commercial benefit against the greater good of the people. That is a huge question.
I want to touch on recent events in the pandemic and talk about politics and journalism, which I know you once said was about people. In fact, politicians about humanity, journalists, we talk about people. I want to ask and go back to your point about writing serious, worthy articles about democracy and so forth, but are we actually asking the right questions and publishing or broadcasting the stories that matter to the rest of the community? So let's use an example of when one of our biggest states locked down for more than 3 months, second wave of the pandemic. Its premier there fronted every day. And the public, because they had not much else to do, were watching this press conference, and the ratings were extraordinary. And they were watching a full press conference where journalists were actually asking questions. They don't normally do that. And there was considerable blowback over the issues some of the journalists asked about and what they later wrote about. Was that a wake-up call for the rest of us?
Well, it was actually preceded, I think, the first time that television, that press conferences were broadcast live was obviously when the 24 networks started up. And I can't remember when that was. That would have been about 20 years ago. 20 years ago.
Yes.
Right. So when that first happened, I remember the full sausage factory was exposed to the public for the first time.
The grinding of pigs' ears.
Quite. And that was a revelation that caused quite a lot of commentary in the blogosphere as it was then.
This is what you guys do, really?
Exactly. Right. So it's not the sort of the meta criticism of the Daniel Andrews daily ritual isn't new. We've had a cycle of this before where the public has looked at us and thought, absolutely not. Whatever those people are doing, absolutely want no bar of that. But anyway, in terms of asking the wrong questions, well, again, look, what's the wrong question? If we go back to the fundamental of the role and my very strong belief that media are not consensus builders, I hope that what we do creates consensus and compromise, but we are not intrinsically consensus builders. We are holding power to account people. Well, then obviously there were failings in Victoria. A lot of those failings were magnified by hyper-partisan nonsense. Absolutely. Some of the reporting was channeled hyper-partisan nonsense rather than facts, right? For sure. But your job during a crisis where the Premier has questions to answer about systemic failures in hotel quarantine, and that's what sparked the second wave, and whether or not contact tracing was up to it, that is absolutely fair game. Of course we've got to ask those questions. Otherwise, what are we doing here? What is our role? So it's sort of, obviously it looks ugly from the point of view of an audience spectator sport. I myself would not line up to watch a press conference if I was out there in the world. But at the end, you've sort of got to look at what emerges at the end. Now, you made the point, obviously, people were looking at that too and saying some of that stank, and they were right. Some of what came out of the sausage factory absolutely, literally stank. It was really not very good. But that dynamic that I saw in press conferences, which is the Premier is before us, we need to try and get this guy to answer a question, particularly in an age where politicians will do everything they can to avoid answering a question. And Andrews is as good as that. Well, exactly. Asking themselves.
What you should have asked me is this. Exactly. I know you've asked me that, but I want to say this.
Which is a lovely segue to what I want to ask you. I've seen you at a couple of press conferences with a Prime Minister, and you've particularly focused on issues that relate to your audience, and one of them is youth unemployment. And you've tried in vain to get a real answer out of the Prime Minister on it. I mean, how frustrating is that for your audience and for you?
I think all of us have been in this situation several times of asking questions that just get shirked or, smirked at or shut down. I think with the youth unemployment issue, maybe the reason that it became a thing is because I go and I ask that question all the time. Because
Yes, you do.
That's the one thing I really care about, and it's the one thing that no one gives me any answers on. So I think it's probably just the repetition of me asking that question and the repetition of getting no answer. That's
and the lack of answers.
The lack of answers.
It's not only that you care about it. I mean, presumably your audience cares about it.
I think a lot of people care about it, not just our audience.
And not just young people.
Yeah,
As a parent of young people, I worry about it.
Economists care about it. It's a massive issue, and it has massive ramifications down the track. I mean, it's definitely frustrating, but all I can do is go there and ask those questions and then highlight the fact that there are no answers. That's all I can do. Often people, who are looking at these press conferences will be like, well, other journalists shouldn't have asked their questions. They should have just supported you in that. And it's like, well, everyone has a question they need to ask, and every question gets shirked.
That's
so,
right.
how do you say what's more important than anything else? So, I think there is sort of a bit of misunderstanding of how we operate, and the fact that because one question wasn't answered, therefore nothing else should be. No other question should come up is quite preposterous.
I think it's a productive process, though. The press conferences going live. I'm with Murph. I'd rather stick knitting needles in my eyeballs than watch them at home. However, I think it's good for us. And another point that Catherine made about our lack of self-reflection. I don't know. I think we're not too bad at that. But okay, we could do more. And this forces us to do more because we're hearing in a very unvarnished way
that is true.
Immediate feedback in real time about the questions we're asking, whether they're apposite, pertinent to people's existence and their need and their want for information. And if they're not, then we need to vary our ways. I think it's a great process.
We've got about 10 minutes to go. Can we discuss the impact of social media generally, but especially amongst young people? So a recent survey found that more than half of young Australians aged between 18 and 29 reported not consuming news at its source. They're either getting news via social media or not consuming news at all. Now, is that just evolving generational change, or is it mainstream media failing to engage young people by not writing or talk about any issues that affect them directly?
It's a tough question because we do our news through social media. So we create news for social media through Instagram stories, things like that. So we are using that to get our information out there. So I think there is a market for mainstream media to do that. They just need to do it well, and they need to do it in a way that doesn't seem contrived to a young audience. It has to be authentic. I do think there is maybe a little bit of failure in that perhaps broadly the media expects a level of understanding that our audience doesn't have. So you might be pitching too high in terms of how you talk about a story. I'll give you an example. I work for the Youth Network, and every single time I do a story or I do a cross, I have to explain what the coalition is. It's a really basic thing. 18-year-olds don't know what the coalition is, so I have to explain things like that. And sometimes we, being people who are in the thick of it every day, just forget that people don't know what that is. Left wing and right wing, that is meaningless to people. So I think if we just go, okay, if I was a 16-year-old, what would I know about? And then write it in that way and don't talk down to an audience, then that would go a very long distance in engaging young audiences. I think that's been a failure. I do think people are picking up on it a lot more. Explainers, for example, very, very popular.
And you do that quite well with legislation or change in policy for things that affect young people quite well, sort of things like job seeker and those sorts of things.
Yeah, and I think that the problem is people assume young people don't care about politics. They don't care about politicians, but they care very deeply about issues. And if you say, this is how this really major thing like the budget is going to affect you, they genuinely care about it. And it's actually really nice in some ways because whenever we do a budget explainer, for example, we get messages going, I didn't listen to the news all day because I knew I wouldn't understand it, but I just was waiting for this article to come out.
Explain it.
And it's just like, okay, great. Well, that means we're actually having an impact in what we do. So I do think that how we target what we do is really important, and we've got to think about, well, what is it that the audience actually wants out of this? And it's really it's easier for me because I have a very defined audience.
Yes.
Whereas it's much harder for you guys because you have to kind of appeal to everyone. So
Yes.
that makes my job easier.
Look, Catherine, just on the other side of social media, we're seeing examples of direct and sometimes very personal social media criticism of objective reporting by some journalists. And it's coming from both the left and the right. Is that something we should be concerned about?
Well, I think it's sort of the down the pub effect, right? What social media does is basically amplify a bunch of conversations that would have happened down the pub, right? I don't know necessarily that there are more of those conversations or less of them, or that they're more vituperative and spiteful than pre-internet or not. I don't know. I don't have an evidence base for that.
They just get out of the window of the pub and
But
onto
they are
our
limited to
computers
the
now.
front bar of the pub.
Well, but that's the point. That's sort of that's the step change that I've been labouring probably slightly too much in this conversation. that is the step change, right, that we're dealing with. So, is it a problem? Well, no, it's not a problem that we're accountable to audiences. That's very important. It's also important that we engage with audiences, but it is hard, obviously, to screen out trolling and disinformation and misinformation. Like, a lot of that crash bombs into public conversations in order to create a ruckus, right? You've got to screen out a lot of noise as a journalist.
It's a full-time job administering those chat rooms.
No, it is.
To filter this stuff.
To filter it, right? So it is difficult. There's a lot of noise you've got to screen out. But yeah, I don't know. It would be fascinating if somehow you could quantify it, right? The down the pub effect because I'm sure that 20 years ago, among people who are into politics, there would have been a conversation in a bar somewhere about what sort of job we'd done through the week, right? Just would have happened. Yeah. But now that happens on a public platform with all of us watching and being tagged in real time.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's fascinating.
Look, let's wrap up. Just have a look at some of the things you're doing on your platforms. And I'll start with you, Mark. You were talking about how expensive it is to do certain things. Seven actually did something a little bit different during the middle of the pandemic. They held a roundtable discussion in a quite austere type studio, got a whole lot of people to actually talk about the pandemic and its impact on the community. I'd just like you to sort of explain what was the aim of it, did it work, and can you see the network doing that on other issues?
Yeah, well, the aim was to do what Shalala so wonderfully described. It's to break things down. People, I think it's a time of immense complexity. People know that their lives are being affected. They've lost their jobs. Their children are at home and not at school. They're restricted in the way they can go about their lives. But I think that there's a lack of detailed understanding about why these things are happening, whether they're productive or not, whether they're working or not. So we wanted to analyse that and do it in a way that allowed people to have that basic information and a level of understanding. In that way, I think it was successful. I got a lot of feedback from it. Yes. And it's something that commercial television doesn't do.
Exactly.
Doesn't do very often. So,
do you think you'll do, is there scope there to do more?
We're planning another, we're planning another on recovery. So part of that was information. We were very particular about the people who we selected as panel guests, people who had interests in areas where their daily lives affected a lot of people and their knowledge base affected a lot of people, so they could increase that knowledge base very quickly. So we had people from areas of real estate. Nothing innovates a person's mind greater than the value of their own house, right, and their assumed wealth. From investment, from small business, restaurants, small business employers. So real life experience. Yes, it was an austere set, and that was, I'm glad you picked that up, but that was, normally we do things with glitz and colour and lights, but we didn't want the set to be the story. We wanted the story to tell itself.
Did you deliberately steer clear of politicians?
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah.
We hear them all the time
that
because we
happens,
didn't we knew what would happen. We knew that the dynamic would become an adversarial one and that it would just become an argument rather than a discussion. We wanted a productive discussion that was engaging, but we also did it, Richard, with real stories. So we had people there, and one of the most affecting parts of that broadcast was a story of an average Australian family living in Toowoomba, outside of Brisbane in Queensland, a truck driver and a nurse who had both lost their jobs, and who, when asked to, what is this, state, they were talking about the state of their parlous finances. So what is the state of that? I don't have enough in the bank to buy a Big Mac.
That's my hands.
And that just, I know it was a crossover moment for that program, and we had so much feedback. And wonderfully, the spirit of people, the humanity of it, people writing, little old ladies writing cheques and sending them to the network to be sent to that family. It was just a gorgeous,
wonderful, positive note.
But it gave people, I think, a personal and instructive insight into what and real world, real life experiences and effects of what's going on.
And The Guardian published what's called The Upside, which has some very interesting stories on it, mainly global stories. It's journalism that aims to seek out answers, solutions, movements and initiatives address the biggest problems besetting the world. Do we need to see more Australian stories like that?
Yeah, well, we try corporately to look for opportunities to do that, to in essence dial down our own role in the structure in terms of that conflict role or in terms of that combat role. We do try and strive for the upside and also sort of more modestly back in some of the territory Shalila was in about explainers and breaking information down in accessible ways. Like we are, as an organisation, we are very self-aware about that. May not always look that way, but we are. So do we need to do more in Australia? Well, yes, but I think we have that very front of mind in the way that we approach daily journalism, as well as the special projects, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's sort of like try to get to either meaningful facts and information, or try and project to a sensible outcome of some type, is really embedded in what we do journalistically.
And you answered the question a bit earlier with the use of explainers. Was there anything else that you think you're doing that sort of adds to the...
Yeah.
Yes, you're going to give me a good...
I think taking politics out of the hands of politicians is, and it's very similar to what Mark was saying. I think that too often we put politicians at the centre of a political story, and to be honest, it doesn't give the audience anything. They don't answer their questions. They make it adversarial. They make it about themselves. And if we can just pull back from that a little bit and go, actually, this story isn't about Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer. This story is about how this particular policy is going to impact you and your wallet. If we can just keep that front in mind all the time, then we'll break through.
The slight flip side of that, I'll do this very quickly because I can see.
I'm getting the call, yes.
No. Slight flip side of that is I do a weekly podcast, and it's a half an hour conversation with either an expert or someone in politics. And that's the opposite of take the politician out of the story. That's put the politician back in the story. But I've said to everybody who comes on the podcast, no talking points. Yeah. We are going to have a conversation. I promise you that I won't, take this out of context. I won't massively beat this up. I won't create some stink as a consequence. But we are going to have a conversation in this half an hour rather than you spouting lines. And it's taken a couple of years, but I'm finally getting there, I think. And that to me feels like a little piece of real estate that I've kind of created in the public space, a modest niche little bit of real estate where I can feel good about what I'm doing. And hopefully they can feel better about what they do as well.
And it helps them because it shows them to be human.
Yeah.
Yes. What a great note to finish on. Thank you very much for taking part. I'm sure we could talk about this for hours, but we've actually got real work to do, like cover Parliament and politicians. Thank you very much for coming in, and goodbye to our world audience.
Thanks,
Thank you.